Let's get started on part 1 of Module 8. Here we're going to talk about how do you implement intensive intervention with fidelity. So in this part, you're going to learn about different methods for measuring fidelity and how to identify the essential components that absolutely need to be included within your delivery of intensive intervention. So why are we talking about this? Remember, we've got our instructional platform. That's our jumping off point for instruction. There we've done a diagnostic to identify students' strengths and weaknesses. We designed that scope and sequence of instruction, and then we identified the instructional platform. We either start with an evidence-based intervention, an evidence-based strategy, or a combination of an intervention and strategy. And when we choose that intervention and strategy, we need to make sure, as this red arrow is so nicely telling us, that we need to implement those things with fidelity. Because we might as well not even be doing the evidence-based intervention or evidence-based strategy if we're not actually doing it as it was designed. So let me give you a little bit of an example here. So here is an evidence-based intervention. This comes from the University of Oregon, and they were so nice to share this example with us. So now I want you to think we've got this nice intervention program that in the past was shown to work with a lot of students to increase students' understanding of mathematics. Now, we take this program and we give it to 7 teachers. So here are our 7 very colorful teachers sitting around talking about this intervention program. Now, I want you to imagine that this teacher right here, this teacher implements all of those intervention lessons and all of the components within each lesson. For example, many times a lesson might have 4 components that you're supposed to do every day. So this teacher is doing all of those components. Now we move to this teacher here. She implements all of the lessons, but only some of the components. She's kind of like, I don't think I need to do all of these things, so she only does some of the components every day. Now we move to this teacher up here. He implements only some of the lessons, so he doesn't do the full program, but when he does do that, he implements all of the components. And then this teacher here might implement some of the lessons and some of the components, so that doesn't seem so great, right? And then this teacher here implements all of the lessons and all of the components, and then also adds in additional practice, perhaps through an evidence-based strategy. This teacher implements some of the lessons and some of the components and then relies on technology to fill in some gaps. And then this teacher here says, no, not going to do it, implements a totally separate intervention. So I need to be able to have a way to measure how all of these teachers implemented the same intervention. And that's where fidelity comes into play. Fidelity is understanding how well a teacher adheres to the intervention or strategy. Now, you've chosen an evidence-based intervention and an evidence-based strategy because they worked for other students. And why did they work for other students? It's likely those teachers or tutors implemented the program as it was meant to be implemented. So we have to be able to measure fidelity in order to understand how those 7 different teachers, how well they're implementing the program. And we can measure fidelity quantitatively or qualitatively. So let's talk about each of these on the next few slides. To measure fidelity quantitatively, we often give a score to the teacher to see how many essential components were completed or were included in the teaching. So we might see something like the teacher completed 96% of the intervention's component when an observation was made of the teacher. We could also see something like the teacher addressed 8 of 10 essential components of explicit instruction. So these are quantitative because we have numbers here that tell us how well the teacher implemented the program. Now, when we see these quantitative checklists or quantitative scores, often they come through a checklist. Here is an example from one intervention. These are the essential components that we would expect a teacher to do during the lesson. Here's another example. This comes from a word problem intervention, and here are the different essential components that we would expect teachers to do if they were doing the program with fidelity. We can also look at checklists like here. So here's a briefer checklist about the components that are essential for explicit instruction. And then here's a very simple checklist. Did the teacher do the review, do the modeling, do the guided practice, the independent practice, and the daily review? Yes or no? So then I could create a score out of 5 or a percentage of time that the teacher adhered to what the program was supposed to be, how the program was supposed to be done. Let me say it that way. So let's go back to our 7 teachers here, okay? And let's say we measured their fidelity of implementation in a quantitative way. So our first teacher, let's see, got a score of 97%. Our second teacher that did all of the lessons but some of the components, 56%. This teacher, some of the lessons and some of the and all of the components, 71. The teacher in the middle who did some of the lessons and some of the components got a 49. This teacher that did all of the lessons and all of the components and added in additional practice, that teacher received a 94. This teacher that only did some of the lessons and some of the components received a 64%. And this teacher who did something totally separate, they still may have hit upon a few components within the intervention, but they scored a 5%. So let me ask you here is which of these teachers, or maybe it's a set of teachers, do you think would have students that would benefit the most from the evidence-based intervention or evidence-based strategy that they employed? I would say that I think this teacher did a pretty good job, this teacher did a really good job, and I really wouldn't rely on results that maybe come from this teacher and some of the others that are sitting in this circle. So now I want you to think about this quantitative fidelity. So workbook activity number 1 is to look at a fidelity checklist, and then there's an accompanying lesson. And I want you to think about what components do you see in the lesson and how does that compare to the fidelity checklist. So you can see how much detail might need to be provided on a fidelity checklist. Now let's return to our circle of teachers and think about qualitative fidelity. Qualitative fidelity is really a rating of how well the intervention or strategy was implemented. So this is getting into the quality of the instruction. So maybe teachers received a score of 1 to 3, which kind of could be a little bit quantitative, but we're still doing a qualitative rating of the instruction that was provided. Or maybe we provided a score, excellent, good, fair, or poor, or maybe even rated students or teacher fidelity according to a traffic light, where green means great and red means not so great. Here's an example of a qualitative checklist. Here was the research assistant. Were they highly effective, moderately effective, or ineffective? So there would be how we would look at the quality of the fidelity of implementation. So let's go back to our teachers and see if we rated them on in a qualitative way, kind of like high quality, medium quality, or low quality, where our teachers would play out. So if I was looking at how well this teacher implemented all of the lessons and all of those components, maybe it was just kind of medium, all right? So it wasn't like the highest quality implementation that I would like to see. This teacher here may have received a high quality score. This teacher here, low. How about this teacher here, high? This teacher who did all of the lessons and all of the components and added in additional practice, maybe she was rated high. This teacher over here, low, and this teacher, high. So then this gives us a different picture of how well these teachers are implementing the evidence-based intervention or the evidence-based strategy. So I want you to think about that with workbook activity number 2. I want you to go back and look at the lesson that you used for activity number 1, and now think about what qualitative components might you include on a qualitative fidelity checklist if a teacher was implementing this lesson. So we've been talking about fidelity, which is adherence to the intervention or strategy. And we can measure fidelity quantitatively, or we can measure fidelity qualitatively. And this is important because once we design this instructional platform, and once we've identified the evidence-based interventions or the evidence-based strategies that are going to be embedded within our instructional platform, we may need to make sure that we're implementing those as they were designed. So when we look at our teachers here, we can see that not all of our teachers were implementing the program in the same way. And so what I would expect is then not all of the students that are working with these teachers are benefiting from the program in the same way. Let's look at workbook activity number 3. First, you're going to look at the materials for a lesson about counting up. And then I want you to think about the quantitative components and the qualitative components that you would include on a fidelity checklist if you were seeing how well that teacher was teaching counting up. And then I want you to watch that video and rate the tutor against your checklist. So why is this important? Well, you can take all your time finding the absolute best evidence-based intervention and all your time finding the best evidence-based strategy for your students. But unless you implement those with fidelity, you've actually wasted your time. You absolutely need to do interventions and strategies as they were designed so that we can make the best outcomes for students. So in this part of Module 8, we've been talking about how do you implement intensive intervention with fidelity. Well, first of all, you need to do it. Become familiar with the lesson guides, become familiar with the manuals, watch videos, learn all about the strategies, watch other teachers. All of that will help you implement interventions and strategies with high fidelity. And then create or use quantitative checklists to see how well you are adhering to the quantitative aspect of fidelity, and then use qualitative indicators to figure out what's your quality of the implementation that you are providing. So let's think about this discussion board. I want you to share your fidelity checklist from activity number 3 and describe how well the tutor adhered to your checklist and have a discussion with your colleagues.